The rain fell against the tall glass windows of Hastings Manor like thrown gravel. It was a freezing, relentless storm, the kind that turned the streets of the estate into rivers of black mud. Inside the grand foyer, however, it was warm. The crystal chandelier burned brightly, casting an expensive golden light over the polished marble floors and the crowd of high society guests who had gathered for the spectacle. Eleanor Hastings stood near the heavy oak doors. She was dressed in a dark, heavy traveling cloak. At her feet sat a single leather suitcase. It was all she was taking. It was all they were allowing her to take. Across the foyer, standing by the sweeping grand staircase, was Arthur, her husband of 6 years. He looked exactly as he always did. Handsome, arrogant, and entirely pleased with himself. He held a crystal glass of cognac in one hand. His other arm was wrapped tightly around the waist of Isabella. Isabella wore a gown of brilliant crimson silk. It was a deliberate choice, a color that demanded the attention of every eye in the room. She stood with a triumphant smile resting on her painted lips, her delicate hand resting protectively over her slightly rounded stomach. The guests, people who had drank Eleanor's wine, eaten at her table, and called her a friend just a week ago, now stood in safe clusters, watching her ruin with polite, cruel fascination. Arthur raised his glass. The murmur of the room fell silent. "Look at her," Arthur said. His voice echoed against the marble, loud and deliberately theatrical. 6 years of my family's grace. 6 years of titles, of luxury, of the Hastings name protecting her. And what do I have to show for it? He paused, letting the silence stretch. He looked down at Isabella, offering her a soft, adoring smile before his eyes snapped back to Eleanor, turning hard and cold. An empty nursery, Arthur continued. A barren, useless wife who could not fulfill her one duty to this family. My mother was right. You were a bad investment, Eleanor. Someone in the crowd let out a low, mocking laugh. Isabella rested her head against Arthur's shoulder, looking at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and absolute victory. But heaven is kind. Arthur announced, his voice rising with pride. Isabella carries the true Hastings heir, the child who will finally secure my uncle's estate, the child who will inherit the Grand Duke's legacy. Eleanor did not blink. She did not weep. Her posture remained perfectly straight. Her face a delicate, heart-shaped silhouette under the dimming light of the entryway, betrayed nothing. Inside the deep pocket of her cloak, her fingers wrapped tightly around a small, silver child's locket. The metal pressed sharply into her palm. Barren. Let them believe it. Let them all believe the lie. It was the armor she had worn for 5 years. It was the agonizing, terrifying price she had paid to keep her real son, Leo, safe from Arthur's greed and his mother's poison. They thought she was empty. They did not know she was a fortress. Take your bag, Eleanor, Arthur sneered, taking a slow sip of his cognac. Leave the keys to the manor on the console. You have disgraced this family long enough. A woman in the crowd, a baroness who's to compliment Eleanor's tea arrangements, leaned forward and whispered something to her neighbor. More quiet laughter rippled through the room. Where will she even go? Isabella asked, her voice pitched perfectly to sound innocent, though her eyes glittered with malice. In this terrible storm. Arthur laughed. It was a cold, dismissive sound. Who cares? Arthur said loudly. She has no family. She has no money. She has nowhere to go. By tomorrow morning, she will be begging at the gates of some charity house. The room waited for Eleanor to break. They waited for the tears. They waited for her to fall to her knees and beg for a room in the servants' quarters, just to stay out of the freezing rain. Instead, Eleanor slowly pulled her hand from her pocket. She adjusted her gloves. She reached down and picked up the handle of her leather suitcase. She looked at Arthur. Her deep blue eyes, usually so sorrowful, were now entirely flat. They were the color of glacial ice. Goodbye, Arthur, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room with devastating clarity. She did not wait for his response. She turned her back to the chandelier, to the crimson dress, to the whispering crowd, and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The freezing wind immediately hit her face, whipping her dark hair around her cheeks. The rain soaked into the hem of her cloak instantly. Behind her, the doors clicked shut, locking her out of the life she had known. She stood on the grand stone steps of Hastings Manor. The driveway was pitched in blackness, battered by the storm. From inside the house, she could hear the faint sound of music starting up again. They were already celebrating her erasure. Eleanor began to walk down the steps, one measured step at a time. Her heels clicked sharply against the wet stone. As she reached the bottom of the steps, a shadow detached itself from the darkness near the towering iron gates. It was not a hired cab. It was not a charity wagon. It was a massive, impeccably polished carriage drawn by 4 midnight black horses. The brass lanterns on the carriage glowed brightly. cutting through the driving rain, and there, emblazoned in pure gold on the lacquered black door of the carriage, was the crest of a rearing stag, the private seal of the Grand Duke. The carriage rolled forward silently, stopping exactly at the edge of the stone path, shielding Eleanor from the wind. The heavy door swung open from the inside. Sitting in the velvet-lined interior was an older man in an immaculate charcoal gray suit. His square, stern face was illuminated by the carriage lantern. Thomas Sterling, the Grand Duke's personal solicitor. He looked at Eleanor standing in the rain. He did not offer pity. He offered a slight, deeply respectful bow of his head. "You kept him waiting long enough, madam," Sterling said, his voice calm and precise. Eleanor handed her wet suitcase to the footman who had materialized from the back of the carriage. "I had to ensure they believed the lie, Thomas." Eleanor said softly, "They believe it." Sterling confirmed, shifting a heavy leather folder resting on his lap. "The Grand Duke is asking for you, and for the boy." Eleanor stepped up into the warmth of the carriage. She settled onto the velvet seat, pulling the door shut behind her with a solid, expensive thud. Up in the grand foyer of Hastings Manor, Arthur happened to glance out the tall glass window. Through the rain, his arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He saw the flash of golden lanterns. He saw the gleam of a black carriage pulling away into the storm, a carriage far wealthier than anything he could afford. He squinted, trying to make out the crest, a sudden cold prickle of confusion touching the back of his neck, but the storm was too thick. The carriage disappeared into the night. Arthur shook his head, taking another drink of his cognac. It was probably just the wind. She was gone. She was nothing. He turned back to the party, unaware that the woman he had just thrown into the mud was already on her way to claim his throne. The carriage moved swiftly through the storm, leaving the glowing windows of Hastings Manor far behind. The rain drummed a heavy, rhythmic beat against the lacquered roof. But inside the velvet-lined cabin, it was silent. Eleanor sat perfectly still, staring out the darkened window. She did not look back. The silver locket in her hand had grown warm against her skin. Thomas Sterling sat opposite her, his hands resting on the thick leather folio. He did not offer meaningless comfort. He knew exactly what she had endured to reach this carriage, and he respected her far too much to treat her like a fragile victim. Arthur was quite pleased with himself. Sterling noted his voice smooth, dry, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I saw him through the glass. He believes he has won. Arthur has always confused cruelty with power." Eleanor said softly, her eyes not leaving the window. "He believes that because he is loud, he is formidable. Let him have his noise, Thomas. We have work to do." After an hour, the carriage slowed. They passed through a set of towering iron gates, 3 times the size of those at Arthur's estate. This was the true seat of the Hastings Empire, the Grand Duke's estate. Where Arthur's home was a flashy, modern display of new money and desperation, this castle was an ancient, sprawling fortress of dark stone, old money, and terrifying influence. The carriage stopped beneath a massive stone portico. Footmen in charcoal livery opened the doors with silent precision, holding broad black umbrellas to shield her from the rain. Eleanor stepped out. As she crossed the threshold into the cavernous, vaulted entrance hall, the heavy oak doors shut behind her, cutting off the sound of the storm completely. "He is in the east wing," Sterling said, handing his damp hat to a waiting servant. "The boy is waiting." Eleanor's breath hitched. It was the only crack in her armor all night. She walked down the long, dimly lit corridors. The walls were lined with centuries of Hastings portraits, men and women of severe faces and absolute authority. She did not look at them. Her pace quickened, her heels echoing against the marble, faster and faster, until she reached a set of heavy mahogany doors at the end of a private hall. A stern-faced nursemaid opened the door and immediately stepped aside, bowing her head. Sitting on a large rug near the fireplace was a 5-year-old boy. He was tracing a wooden block with serious, concentrated focus. He had thick, dark hair and striking, deep blue eyes. Even at 5, the sharp, aristocratic lines of his jaw were unmistakable. He was the perfect, undeniable image of the Grand Duke in his youth. "Leo." He looked up at the sound of the door. "Mother," he said, dropping the wooden block. Eleanor fell to her knees. She did not care that her traveling cloak was damp or that the floor was hard. She caught him as he ran into her arms, pressing her face into his dark hair, breathing in the scent of him. Her hands, which had been so cold and still when Arthur threw her out, now trembled as she held her son. She had hidden him the day he was born. She had bribed a doctor to declare him stillborn, sending him away in the dead of night to the Grand Duke's protection. She knew that Arthur's mother, the Dowager, would have found a way to quietly eliminate the child if she thought he threatened her control over Arthur's inheritance. Eleanor had traded her reputation, her dignity, and her right to be called a mother, all to keep him breathing. She pulled back just enough to look at his face. She opened the silver locket in her hand, revealing a tiny portrait of him as an infant. "You are safe," she whispered, her thumbs brushing his cheeks. "And you will never have to hide again? Are you staying?" Leo asked, his voice steady, too mature for his age. "I am never leaving you again," Eleanor promised. The sorrow in her eyes hardened, freezing over once more. The mother's vulnerability vanished, replaced by the lethal resolve of a queen securing her bloodline. Sterling appeared in the doorway. "Madam, it is time." Eleanor kissed Leo's forehead, stood up, and followed the solicitor down the hall to the master chambers. The room smelled of old wood, heavy velvet, and medicinal herbs. A massive fire burned in the hearth, throwing flickering light over the massive four-poster bed. The Grand Duke lay against a mountain of pillows. He was 82, his body frail and failing, but his eyes, the exact same piercing blue as Leo's, were sharp and merciless. "Eleanor?" The Grand Duke rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves on stone. "Your Grace?" she said, approaching the bed and inclining her head. "Sterling tells me my idiot nephew finally threw you out." The old man wheezed, a bitter, humorless smile touching his pale lips. "To make room for a mistress, a pregnant mistress. He believes she carries the true heir," Eleanor replied calmly. The Grand Duke let out a low, rattling scoff. "Arthur plays with copper and demands the world treat it like gold. He is weak. His mother is a venomous snake. They would have destroyed my legacy in a week." The old man shifted, his sharp eyes locking onto Eleanor. "But you have the spine of a proper Hastings. You suffered their insults for 5 years to protect my true blood. You bled for this family while Arthur drank my wine." Sterling stepped forward, opening the heavy leather folio. He laid a thick parchment document on the bedside table. "The paperwork is complete, Your Grace," Sterling said quietly. "Read the clause, Thomas," the Grand Duke commanded. Sterling adjusted his glasses. "Upon the signing of this document, Lady Eleanor Hastings is hereby named the sole trustee and regent of the Hastings estate, encompassing all properties, banking institutions, and liquid assets. She shall hold absolute financial and legal authority until the true heir, Leo Hastings, reaches the age of 21. No other party, by blood or marriage, may contest her decisions." Eleanor stood perfectly still. The magnitude of the document hung in the air. "Give me the pen," the Grand Duke ordered. Sterling handed him a heavy gold fountain pen. With a shaking but deliberate hand, the old man signed his name across the bottom of the parchment. Sterling then produced a stick of deep crimson wax. He melted it over a candle, letting it drip thick and hot onto the parchment. The Grand Duke took his heavy brass signet ring, the rearing stag, and pressed it firmly into the wax. A dull, heavy thud. The seal was set. "It is done," the Grand Duke whispered, falling back against the pillows, his eyes closing in exhaustion. "Break him, Eleanor. Do not leave them a single copper coin." "I will leave them exactly what they left me," Eleanor said, her voice a quiet, terrifying promise. "Nothing." An hour later, Eleanor stood in the master suite that had been prepared for her. A silent maid had drawn her a hot bath and taken away the damp, ruined traveling cloak, the last physical trace of the woman Arthur had banished. When Eleanor emerged from the dressing room, she was unrecognizable from the quiet, humiliated wife who had stood in the rain. She wore a gown of heavy midnight black silk. It was devoid of flashy embroidery, tailored with sharp, severe lines that radiated authority. A pair of simple, flawless diamond studs rested in her ears. Her dark hair was swept up into an immaculate, tightly coiled style. She looked at her reflection in the tall mirror. She was no longer a victim. She was the bank. She was the landlord. She was the architect of their ruin. She picked up the leather folio containing the sealed decree, her fingers tracing the hardened red wax, and prepared to write her first command. 3 weeks passed. To Arthur Hastings, they were the most glorious 3 weeks of his life. Hastings Manor had been entirely scrubbed of Eleanor's presence. Her books were thrown out, her quiet, elegant taste in decor replaced by heavy, gilded mirrors and imported velvet drapery that Isabella preferred. The manor was no longer a home, it was a stage, and Arthur was the undisputed star. On a brisk Thursday evening, the dining room of Hastings Manor was packed with 30 of London's most elite socialites. The table groaned under the weight of roasted pheasants, imported caviar, and endless bottles of vintage champagne. Laughter bounced off the newly gilded ceiling. At the head of the table, Arthur sat with his waistcoat unbuttoned, his cheeks flushed with wine and the intoxicating warmth of his own hubris. To his right sat Isabella, draped in an emerald silk gown that cost more than a commoner's house, her hand resting delicately on her growing stomach. To the future duke, a young baron called out, raising his glass from the other end of the table. Arthur smiled, waving a lazy, dismissive hand, though he soaked up the title like a sponge. Not yet, my friends. My uncle still breathes, though the doctors assure me it is only a matter of time. He rests quietly at his estate, and when he passes, the transition will be seamless. The Hastings line is secure. He reached over and kissed Isabella's hand. The table erupted in polite applause. And what of your previous arrangement? Asked a curious countess, sipping her champagne. Has the former Lady Hastings made any trouble? Arthur scoffed, taking a long drink. Eleanor, please. She vanished into the mud where she belongs, probably working as a governess in some damp country house. She hasn't the funds to hire a solicitor, let alone cause trouble. She is entirely erased, as she should be. Isabella chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. A woman who cannot provide an heir has no place holding back a man of Arthur's stature. Arthur patted her hand affectionately. Do not trouble yourself with ghosts, my love. Focus on tomorrow. The jeweler on Bond Street has secured the diamond parure you wanted. We shall go in the morning to collect it. The £60,000 set? Isabella gasped, her eyes widening with greed. Arthur, you spoil me. Nothing is too expensive for the mother of the next Grand Duke. Arthur declared loudly, making sure the entire table heard the price tag. He did not have £60,000 in cash, of course. No one in his circle did. He operated on the Hastings name, drawing freely from the royal bank's unlimited credit lines reserved for the family. It was a well of wealth he believed had no bottom. He raised his glass again, and the room cheered. 50 miles away, the Walnut Boardroom at the Grand Duke's estate was wrapped in absolute, suffocating silence. There was no clinking of champagne flutes here. There was only the steady ticking of a grandfather clock, and the sharp, deliberate scrape of a fountain pen against thick paper. Eleanor sat behind the massive mahogany desk. She wore her signature midnight black silk, the high collar framing her pale, perfectly composed face. Her dark hair was pinned flawlessly in place. The silver locket rested on the polished wood next to the inkwell, a quiet reminder of exactly why she was sitting in this chair. Across from her stood Thomas Sterling. He was not drinking wine. He was holding a stack of leather-bound financial ledgers. His spending has accelerated. Sterling reported, his voice crisp and professional. In the past 3 weeks, Arthur has drawn heavily against the family's primary credit lines, redecorating the manor, throwing banquets, and ordering custom carriages. And yesterday, he placed a hold on a diamond parure at House of Carriage. £60,000. Eleanor's expression did not change. She did not express outrage. She did not sigh. She simply turned the page of the ledger in front of her, scanning the long columns of Arthur's arrogance, translated into numbers. He is spending money that belongs to my son, Eleanor said softly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He operates under the assumption that the bank will continue to honor his signature, as they always have. Sterling explained. The bank directors are unaware of the Grand Duke's new decree. As far as London knows, Arthur is still the acting heir. Then it is time London learned otherwise, Eleanor said. She pulled a fresh sheet of heavy, cream-colored parchment from the drawer. It bore the embossed crest of the Grand Duke at the top. She picked up the gold fountain pen. Her hand did not shake. Draft the directive, Thomas, she commanded, her eyes locked on the paper. Notify the Royal Bank of London. Effective immediately, every personal account, every line of credit, and every promissory note bearing Arthur Hastings' name is to be frozen indefinitely. He is stripped of his signing authority. He is denied access to the family vaults. Sterling's pen flew across his notepad, capturing her words. And if he attempts to draw funds on existing open accounts, the bank is to decline the transaction? Eleanor replied, her voice smooth and cold, publicly, if necessary. Let them cite orders from the sole trustee of the Hastings estate. Eleanor finished writing her own formal letter of instruction to the bank's board of directors. She set the pen down. The silence in the room returned, heavy with the weight of the financial execution she had just ordered. Sterling stepped forward with a lit candle and the thick stick of crimson wax. He held it over the bottom of the parchment. The wax melted. It fell onto the paper in a dark, heavy pool, looking remarkably like a drop of fresh blood. Eleanor picked up the heavy brass signet ring, the rearing stag. She pressed it down into the hot wax, holding it there for a long moment, ensuring the impression was deep, flawless, and permanent. She lifted the ring. The seal was perfect. Send this by private courier, Eleanor instructed, sliding the document across the mahogany desk. Ensure it is in the hands of the bank's chief director before the doors open tomorrow morning. Sterling took the parchment, slipping it into a leather portfolio. It will be done, madam. Arthur is planning to visit the jeweler at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Let him, Eleanor said, picking up her silver locket and closing her hand around it. Let him walk into the light. It will make the dark so much colder when the door closes on him. The morning sun over Bond Street was bright and merciless, casting a brilliant glow over the polished storefronts of London's most exclusive shopping district. At exactly 10 o'clock, Arthur's carriage pulled up to the curb outside the house of Garrard. The footman hurried to open the door, and Arthur stepped out, adjusting his tailored morning coat. He reached back, taking Isabella's hand and helping her onto the pavement. She was dressed in a lavish carriage gown of pale peach silk, her chin tilted up to ensure everyone on the street saw exactly who she was. The interior of Garrard was a sanctuary of quiet wealth. Crystal chandeliers reflected off glass display cases filled with sapphires, rubies, and gold. The air smelled of expensive perfume and polished mahogany. It was also a sanctuary of social surveillance. Half a dozen prominent members of society, a duchess, 2 countesses, and the wives of 3 powerful politicians, were already browsing the displays. They discreetly lowered their voices as Arthur and Isabella walked in. Arthur did not mind the stares. In fact, he craved them. Beaumont, the senior manager of the boutique, hurried forward. He was a man whose entire career was built on discretion and recognizing the exact net worth of everyone who walked through his doors. Hastings, Beaumont greeted, offering a deep, respectful bow. And the lovely Miss Isabella. We have been expecting you. The private viewing room is ready. Nonsense, Beaumont, Arthur said loudly, waving a dismissive hand. We have nothing to hide. Bring the parure out here. Let the morning light hit it. Beaumont hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting toward the other elite clients in the room. As you wish, sir. A moment later, Beaumont returned carrying a velvet tray. Resting on the dark fabric was a breathtaking diamond parure, a necklace, earrings, and bracelet dripping with perfectly cut stones. The sheer brilliance of the diamonds commanded the attention of every woman in the room. The quiet murmurs stopped entirely. Isabella let out a theatrical gasp. Arthur, it is magnificent. Only the best for the mother of the true Hastings heir, Arthur announced, ensuring his voice carried to the back of the boutique. He picked up the heavy diamond necklace and stepped behind Isabella, securing the platinum clasp around her neck. She turned to face the mirrored pillar, touching the cold stones against her collarbone. She looked every inch a queen. The aristocrats, pretending to look at watches nearby, were watching her with naked envy. Arthur beamed, intoxicated by his own perceived power. We will take it, Beaumont, Arthur declared, not even asking for the price. 60,000, I believe. Put it on the Hastings primary account. Have the paperwork sent to the manor. Beaumont offered a tight, polite smile. Of course, sir. If you will excuse me for just one moment to verify the ledger. Arthur turned to a nearby countess, striking up a conversation about the upcoming racing season, acting as though spending £60,000 was as trivial as buying a newspaper. Isabella continued to admire herself in the glass, entirely blind to the impending drop. 5 minutes passed. When Beaumont emerged from the back office, he was not carrying the receipt. He was holding a piece of paper, and his face was entirely pale. The professional warmth had drained from his expression, replaced by a rigid, uncomfortable tension. He walked up to Arthur, stepping slightly closer than usual. Hastings. Beaumont murmured, his voice pitched exceptionally low. If I might have a word with you in the private office. It concerns the transaction. Arthur frowned, annoyed by the interruption to his social performance. Speak up, Beaumont. I have a luncheon at noon. Is there a problem with the paperwork? Sir, I must insist. I insist you tell me what the delay is. Arthur snapped, his voice rising, drawing the absolute attention of the entire room. The Duchess, near the window, stopped, pretending to look at pearl rings. The room went perfectly still. Beaumont swallowed hard. Arthur had forced his hand. I have just received a courier dispatch from the Royal Bank of London. Beaumont said, his voice level and clear. Your signature is no longer recognized, sir. The bank has declined the transaction. Arthur froze. The arrogant smile vanished from his face. "Excuse me, your accounts, Mr. Hastings." Beaumont continued, his tone turning crisp and apologetic, yet devastatingly firm. "All lines of credit, all personal drafts, and all familial accounts bearing your name have been indefinitely frozen." A suffocating silence fell over the house of Carriage. Isabella's hand froze mid-air as she reached for one of the diamond earrings. "That is impossible," Arthur growled, his face flushing a deep, furious red. "I am the heir to the Grand Duke. The Hastings account is bottomless. You have made a mistake, Beaumont. And it is going to cost you your position." "There is no mistake, sir," Beaumont replied, refusing to back down. He held up the paper. A formal bank notice. "The directive was issued at 8 o'clock this morning. It is not a temporary hold. You have been stripped of your signing authority." Arthur stared at the paper, the words blurred in front of his eyes. "On whose authority?" "My uncle is on his deathbed." "The directive was legally sealed and issued by the sole trustee of the Hastings estate," Beaumont stated. "Sole trustee." Arthur breathed, his voice betraying a flicker of genuine panic. "What sole trustee?" "I am the only male heir." Beaumont did not answer the question. He did not need to. The social execution was already complete. The store manager looked at Isabella, his eyes dropping to the glittering stones around her neck. "I am terribly sorry, Miss Isabella," Beaumont said quietly, "but I must ask for the necklace back." Isabella looked at Arthur, her eyes wide with shock and humiliation. "Arthur, do something?" Arthur stood paralyzed. The room was watching. The women who had envied her 5 minutes ago were now staring with barely concealed pity and amusement. The golden boy of London high society had just been publicly declined. "Arthur!" Isabella hissed, her cheeks burning. "Take it off." Arthur choked out, his voice hoarse, refusing to look at her. With trembling hands, Isabella reached behind her neck. She struggled with the platinum clasp, her perfectly manicured fingers slipping. The diamonds, which had felt like a crown only moments ago, now felt like a chain of lead. She finally undid the clasp, the heavy necklace sliding from her skin. She placed it back on the velvet tray. The soft clink of the diamonds hitting the fabric sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Arthur turned on his heel and marched out of the boutique. He did not wait for Isabella. He pushed past the footman, climbing into the carriage, with his face burning, his mind racing. As Isabella hurried out the door behind him, keeping her head down to avoid the stares of the laughing countesses, the brilliant morning sun no longer felt warm. It felt like a spotlight on their ruin. The heavy front doors of Hastings Manor slammed shut, rattling the gilded mirrors in the foyer. Arthur marched into the drawing room, his face a storm of rage and humiliation. He went straight to the liquor cabinet, pouring a glass of whiskey with hands that shook so violently the crystal decanter struck the rim of his glass. Isabella trailed behind him, her face stained with tears. She threw herself onto the velvet sofa, weeping not for Arthur's distress, but for the devastating public mortification she had just endured. "The Duchess was laughing at me, Arthur!" Isabella sobbed, twisting a silk handkerchief in her hands. "The entire store watched me take that necklace off like a common thief!" "You promised me I would be untouched." "You promised me the world." "Shut up, Isabella!" Arthur snapped, downing his whiskey in one swallow. "I am trying to think. What is the meaning of this vulgar shouting?" The cold, sharp voice cut through the room like a whip. Standing in the doorway was Lady Agatha Hastings, the Dowager. She wore a severe gown of dark plum, her silver hair pinned tightly against her skull. She possessed none of Arthur's loud bravado. Her power was quiet, venomous, and absolute. Arthur turned to his mother, his arrogance fracturing the bank. "Mother, Beaumont at Carriage just declined my signature. He claimed my accounts are frozen." "All of them?" Agatha's eyes narrowed. The irritation in her expression hardened into something dangerous. "Do not be absurd. You are a Hastings. Our accounts do not freeze." Beaumont said a directive was issued this morning. Arthur insisted, his voice pitching higher with panic. "Signed by the sole trustee of the estate." Sole trustee. Agatha repeated the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. "Your uncle is on his deathbed. He is barely lucid. He has no trustee. He has only you." She stared at her son, assessing his trembling hands and flushed face. Disgust rippled through her. Arthur was a useful pawn, but he was entirely incapable of handling a real crisis. "Stop drinking," Agatha commanded sharply, "and tell the sweeping girl to go to her room. I will handle the bank." Within an hour, the Dowager's carriage pulled up to the imposing stone facade of the Royal Bank of London. Agatha did not wait to be escorted. She swept through the heavy bronze doors, bypassing the tellers entirely, and marched straight toward the grand staircase leading to the executive offices. Director Harrison was a man who usually bowed deeply when Agatha entered a room. He had managed the Hastings wealth for 20 years and had always been wonderfully compliant. Today, however, as Agatha pushed open the doors to his office, Harrison did not stand up immediately. He finished signing a document, placed his pen down, and then rose slowly. There was no fear in his eyes. There was only a professional, impenetrable distance. "Lady Hastings," Harrison said, his tone perfectly flat, "to what do I owe the honor?" "Do not play games with me, Harrison," Agatha hissed, slamming her gloved hands onto the edge of his mahogany desk. "I want the freeze on Arthur's accounts lifted immediately. I do not know what bureaucratic error caused this embarrassment at the jeweler today, but you will fix it before noon, or I will see you removed from this institution." Harrison did not flinch. He walked over to a heavy iron safe in the corner of his office. He turned the dial, unlocked the heavy door, and withdrew a leather portfolio. "There is no error, Lady Hastings," Harrison said calmly, returning to his desk. He opened the folder and placed a thick, cream-colored parchment on the desk between them. Agatha looked down. At the bottom of the page rested a massive drop of deep crimson wax. Stamped perfectly into the center was the rearing stag of the Grand Duke. Agatha's breath caught in her throat. She knew that seal. It was the absolute, undeniable mark of ultimate authority within the family. It was not a stamp the Grand Duke handed out lightly. In fact, he had not used it in over a decade. The directive was delivered by the Grand Duke's personal solicitor this morning. Harrison explained, keeping his hand firmly over the bottom half of the page, covering the signature. "It explicitly strips Arthur Hastings of all financial privileges. He is denied access to the vaults, the ledgers, and all lines of credit." "Wait, whose order?" Agatha demanded, her voice shaking with a sudden, terrifying realization. "Show me the name!" "Who is the trustee? I cannot do that," Harrison replied, his voice dropping to a cool whisper. "The trustee has ordered strict confidentiality. The identity will be revealed only at the formal reading of His Grace's will. Until then, I take my orders exclusively from the holder of that seal." Agatha stared at the red wax. It looked like a drop of fresh blood on the paper. Someone had outmaneuvered her. Someone had gotten into the east wing of the Grand Duke's estate, bypassed her spies, and stolen her son's empire in the middle of the night. "You will regret this," Agatha whispered, though the threat sounded hollow even to her. "I am merely following law, madam," Harrison said, pulling the document back and closing the folder. "Good day." When Agatha returned to Hastings Manor, the atmosphere had shifted from anger to sheer panic. In the grand foyer, Arthur was arguing loudly with the head butler. "What do you mean the butcher refused the order?" Arthur yelled. "They said our credit is no longer good, sir." The butler replied, looking deeply uncomfortable. "And the wine merchant has sent a boy demanding payment for last month's delivery. He says he will not leave the kitchen until he is paid in coin." Agatha walked past them without a word. She moved into the drawing room and collapsed into an armchair, her chest heaving. The fortress she had built around her son was collapsing. Isabella was standing near the window. She had changed out of her silk carriage gown into something simpler. She held her hands over her stomach, watching the chaos unfold with wide, terrified eyes. She had tolerated Arthur's arrogance because it came with a title and a bottomless fortune. She had stood by and smiled as they threw Eleanor out into the freezing rain, believing she was stepping into a life of untouchable luxury. But as Isabella listened to Arthur screaming at a servant over unpaid grocery bills, the glittering illusion shattered. She looked around the heavily gilded room. It no longer felt like a palace. It felt like a trap. And somewhere in the city, holding a seal of red wax, the real architect of their ruin was quietly waiting for the final act. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a solemn rider dressed in the charcoal livery of the Grand Duke's household. It was a heavy envelope sealed with black wax and bordered in thick black ink. Inside Hastings Manor, the atmosphere had grown remarkably grim over the past week. 3 of the senior servants had resigned after their wages were delayed. The grand floral arrangements in the foyer had withered and been discarded, leaving empty porcelain vases that echoed the growing emptiness of the house. Arthur tore the black, bordered envelope open. He read the heavy parchment once, his eyes scanning the elegant, archaic script. Then he threw his head back and let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. "He is dead!" Arthur announced, waving the parchment in the air. "The stubborn old man has finally taken his last breath." The Dowager, who had been sitting rigidly by the cold fireplace, stood up. Her face was pale, lined with the severe stress of the past weeks. "Arthur, lower your voice. The servants can hear you." "Let them hear," Arthur shouted, pouring himself a generous measure of brandy, ignoring the fact that it was not yet noon. "Let the entire city hear! The Grand Duke is dead, and this—" He tapped the parchment aggressively. "It's the formal summons. The reading of the will takes place at his estate this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Isabella appeared in the doorway of the drawing room. She looked tired, the stress of the frozen accounts and unpaid dressmakers taking a toll on her usually radiant features. But at Arthur's words, a spark of desperate hope ignited in her eyes. "The reading of the will." Isabella asked, stepping into the room. "Does this mean the freeze on your accounts?" "It means the nightmare is over, my love," Arthur said, crossing the room to pull her into a tight embrace. My uncle's mind was clearly failing at the end. He likely appointed some interim steward, this sole trustee Beaumont mentioned, to manage the ledgers while he was bedridden. But death dissolves the stewardship. The bloodline dictates the inheritance. I am the only male Hastings left alive. By 5 o'clock today, the title, the bank, the estate, all of it will be legally mine. Agatha watched her son's manic confidence, her stomach tightening with a dark, unnameable dread. She had seen the red wax seal. She had seen the absolute, terrifying finality in the bank director's eyes. This did not feel like the end of a bureaucratic inconvenience. It felt like a trap springing shut. "Arthur." Agatha warned, her voice uncharacteristically cautious. "Do not be so foolishly certain. We do not know what the old man wrote in that document. What else could he write?" Arthur scoffed, finishing his brandy and setting the glass down with a heavy clink. "He despised me, yes, but he worshipped the family name. He would never leave the empire to a distant cousin, and he certainly wouldn't leave it to charity. I am the only option. Now go upstairs and change, both of you. We are not arriving at my new castle looking like defeated beggars." Isabella did not need to be told twice. She rushed upstairs, calling for her remaining maid. She spent 2 hours preparing, determined to look every inch the future Duchess. She chose her most aggressive, vibrant gown, a sweeping dress of crimson silk, heavily embroidered with gold thread. She wore no diamonds, thanks to the humiliation at Carriage, but she held her head high, her hand resting prominently on her pregnant belly. She was the vessel of the future. She would make them all bow. At 2 o'clock, the Hastings carriage departed for the Grand Duke's estate. The journey was tense. Arthur talked incessantly, mapping out his plans for the Grand Duke's wealth. He spoke of new investments, of selling off the older properties, of firing Harrison at the bank. Isabella listened with rapt attention, nodding and smiling, the color returning to her cheeks. Agatha sat in the corner of the carriage in absolute silence, her hands tightly gripping the handle of her parasol. When the carriage passed through the massive iron gates of the Grand Duke's estate, Arthur leaned out the window, looking up at the towering stone battlements. "Magnificent," he whispered, greed shining openly in his watery blue eyes. "And entirely mine." The carriage stopped beneath the stone portico. Arthur stepped out first, offering his hand to Isabella. He led his pregnant mistress and his mother up the broad stone steps, acting not like a mourning nephew, but like a conquering king returning to claim his throne. The heavy oak doors swung open before Arthur could even raise his hand to the knocker. Standing in the dim, cavernous entrance hall was Thomas Sterling. The solicitor wore a black morning suit, his expression as unreadable and hard as the marble floor beneath his feet. "Arthur," Sterling said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He did not offer a bow. He did not say, "Your Grace." Arthur frowned at the lack of deference, but he puffed out his chest. "Sterling, a tragic day for the family, but we must carry on. Take us to the reading." "The others are already waiting," Sterling said simply. He turned on his heel, his dark coat sweeping behind him, and began to walk down the long, portrait-lined corridor. "Others." Isabella whispered to Arthur, her grip tightening on his arm. "What others?" "Just the minor beneficiaries." Arthur muttered dismissively, patting her hand. "Servants getting their pensions. Distant cousins hoping for a silver teapot. Nothing that concerns us." They followed the solicitor through the silent, ancient halls. The air here was heavy, smelling of old paper, cold stone, and history. The portraits of past dukes seemed to stare down at Arthur with quiet judgment, but he ignored them, his eyes fixed firmly on the heavy double-door doors at the end of the corridor. The Walnut Boardroom. Sterling stopped before the doors. He placed his hands on the brass handles, turning his head slightly to look at Arthur. There was no pity in the solicitor's eyes. There was only the cold, precise look of an executioner about to pull the lever. "Inside, Arthur," Sterling said softly. He pushed the doors open. The heavy double doors of the Walnut boardroom swung open smoothly, yielding to Arthur's aggressive push. He stepped over the threshold, his chin raised high, a look of supreme entitlement plastered across his flushed face. Isabella followed closely, her crimson silk gown rustling loudly in the quiet space, while the Dowager trailed behind them, her face drawn and tight. The boardroom was a masterpiece of old, intimidating wealth. The walls were paneled in dark, rich walnut, lined with leather, bound legal volumes spanning 3 centuries. Down the center of the room stretched a massive, polished mahogany table. Waiting in the room were 6 men. They were the most senior stewards of the Grand Duke's estate, men who managed the shipping fleets, the land deeds, and the royal banking divisions. They stood silently in their tailored mourning suits, their hands clasped behind their backs. As Arthur entered, none of them bowed. None of them offered their condolences. They simply watched him. "Gentlemen," Arthur announced, clapping his hands together as he walked confidently toward the head of the long table. "A dark day for the family, to be sure, but the Hastings legacy endures. You may take your seats. Let us dispense with the formalities so we can begin charting the future of this estate." He reached out, placing his hands on the carved back of the Grand Duke's massive leather chair, preparing to pull it out and take his seat. "That chair is reserved, Arthur," Thomas Sterling said. The solicitor had followed them into the room and now stood near the heavy windows, his leather folio tucked under his arm. Arthur paused, a patronizing smile touching his lips. "Reserved. Sterling, my uncle is dead. I am the only male heir of this bloodline. That chair belongs to me." "That chair belongs to the head of the Hastings family," Sterling corrected, his voice perfectly level. "And you are standing in her way." Arthur's patronizing smile froze. Isabella's hand tightened on his arm. Agatha, standing near the doorway, suddenly stopped breathing. A sharp, distinct click echoed through the room. At the far end of the boardroom, a set of private, concealed oak doors unlatched. The heavy wood swung outward. The sound of a woman's heels clicked against the polished floorboards. Slow, measured, utterly unhurried. Eleanor Hastings walked into the light. Arthur stared. His brain violently rejected what his eyes were showing him. This was not the broken, weeping woman he had thrown out into the freezing rain. This was not a beggar who had nowhere to go. She wore a gown of midnight black silk, the fabric drinking in the light of the room. The severe, flawless tailoring radiated an absolute, terrifying authority. The simple diamond studs in her ears flashed like ice. Her dark hair was coiled like a crown, and her posture was that of a monarch who had returned to a conquered city. The 6 senior stewards at the table immediately bowed their heads in deep, synchronized respect. "Eleanor," Arthur choked out. His voice cracked, the words scraping against his dry throat. What are you doing here?" Eleanor did not answer him. Her icy blue eyes swept over him, as if he were a piece of misplaced furniture. She walked toward the head of the table. Agatha whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden, suffocating panic. "Look, Doc." Stepping out from the shadows behind Eleanor was a 5-year-old boy. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit. His dark hair was brushed neatly, and he held his mother's hand with quiet confidence. But it was his face that stripped the air from the room. The Dowager let go of her parasol. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent clatter. She braced her hand against the wall, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She was looking at the ghost of the Grand Duke. The aristocratic jaw, the sharp cheekbones, the piercing, unforgiving blue eyes. It was a genetic mirror. It was undeniable. "No," Arthur breathed, stumbling back a step, knocking into the heavy leather chair. "No, you are barren. You never gave me a child, but I gave the Hastings family an heir." Eleanor said, her voice dropping into the silent room like a heavy stone into a still pond. She placed her hand gently on Leo's shoulder. "I kept him from you. For 5 years I let you call me useless, and I let you parade your mistresses because it was the only way to ensure my son would survive his father's greed." Isabella let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hands flew to her own stomach, her crimson dress suddenly feeling entirely inadequate. The child she carried, the child Arthur had promised would inherit the world, had just been reduced to a meaningless bastard in the span of 10 seconds. "This is a trick!" Arthur shouted, his face turning an ugly, panicked shade of red. He pointed a shaking finger at the boy. "That is not my son. You found some orphan on the streets to steal my inheritance. I demand a physician. I demand a legal inquiry." Thomas Sterling stepped forward, breaking the red wax seal on his leather folio. "There will be no inquiry, Arthur," Sterling said loudly, his voice echoing off the walnut walls. The Grand Duke conducted his own investigations 5 years ago. He verified the birth, he verified the bloodline, and 3 weeks ago, upon his deathbed, he secured the legal reality of this estate. Sterling opened the heavy parchment, where the final, unalterable will and testament of His Grace, the Grand Duke of Hastings. Sterling read, his voice ringing with absolute finality. The entirety of the Hastings estate, including all land deeds, banking institutions, unentailed wealth, and the ducal title, is hereby passed to his legitimate great-nephew, Leo Hastings. Arthur staggered, his knees physically giving out for a second before he caught himself on the edge of the table. Furthermore, Sterling continued, turning the page, until the young Duke reaches the age of 20. The estate shall be governed exclusively by his mother. Lady Eleanor Hastings is hereby recognized as the sole trustee, regent, and ultimate financial authority of the Hastings Empire. The room fell so quiet they could hear the rain starting to hit the window panes outside. Arthur looked at Eleanor, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had thrown away. She was standing at the head of the table, holding the hand of the true Duke, looking down at him with a cold, devastating calm. He had boasted that she had nowhere to go. He had not realized she already owned the floor he was standing on. The crushing weight of Sterling's words settled over the Walnut boardroom. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of Arthur Hastings. He stared at the parchment in Sterling's hands, then at the severe, unyielding faces of the 6 stewards. Finally, his eyes dragged themselves back to Eleanor. She had not moved. She had not offered a triumphant smile. She simply watched him drown. Isabella broke the silence. Nothing. Isabella shrieked, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of the polished elegance she had tried so hard to project. She spun toward Arthur, her hands clutching the fabric of her crimson gown. "You told me you were the sole heir! You told me my child would be the Duke! You have nothing!" Arthur reached out, his hand shaking, desperately trying to catch her arm. "Isabella, please, we will fight this in the courts. We will." "Fight with what money?" Isabella screamed, slapping his hand away as if his touch burned her. "Your accounts are frozen! Your credit is dead! You couldn't even buy me a necklace yesterday! You are a fraud, Arthur!" She looked at Eleanor, her chest heaving, searching for a trace of mercy in the older woman's icy blue eyes. There was none. Isabella realized, with sickening clarity, that the Hastings Empire would never offer her a single coin. She was tied to a ruined man. Without another word, Isabella hiked up the skirts of her expensive silk gown, pushed past the Dowager, and fled the boardroom. Her hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor, fading into nothing. Arthur watched her go, his jaw slack, the last shred of his inflated ego tearing away. Eleanor, a raspy, desperate voice broke in. The Dowager stepped forward. The venomous, absolute authority she had wielded for decades was gone. Her silver hair seemed thinner, her shoulders stooped. She looked like a terrified old woman. "Eleanor, my dear," Agatha said, forcing a trembling, entirely artificial smile onto her lips. She held out her hands in a gesture of supplication. This is a shock, of course. But you are a Hastings. You are the mother of my grandson. We are family. Surely we can arrange an allowance, a modest estate in the country for Arthur and myself. You would not leave your own family destitute." Eleanor looked at her former mother-in-law. Her hand tightened slightly on Leo's shoulder, a protective, maternal reflex. "Family." Eleanor repeated, the word sounding like ice cracking. "When the doctor told me I was pregnant 5 years ago, you cornered me in the winter garden. Do you remember what you said to me, Agatha?" The Dowager flinched, her pale eyes darting toward the floor. "You told me that if the child was a boy, you would ensure he was raised away from my weak influence." Eleanor continued, her voice perfectly calm, but loud enough for every steward in the room to hear. "You planned to take him from my arms the moment he was born. You planned to erase me entirely. I handed my newborn son to a stranger in the dead of night to save him from your poison." Agatha opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "You have no grandson?" Eleanor stated, delivering the final, fatal blow to the Dowager's pride. "You have a regent who remembers exactly who you are. Thomas will provide you with the address of a modest boarding house in Yorkshire. The rent is paid for 6 months. After that, you are on your own." The Dowager let out a small, broken sob. She turned, leaning heavily on her walking stick, and shuffled out of the room, looking 20 years older than when she had entered. That left only Arthur. He stood at the end of the long mahogany table, entirely alone. The friends who drank his wine were gone. The mistress who loved his title had fled. The mother who manipulated him was ruined. His knees buckled. Arthur Hastings, the golden boy of London high society, fell to his knees on the the polished hardwood floor. Eluna, he wept, tears finally spilling from his watery blue eyes, tracing tracks down his flushed cheeks. Eleanor, I am sorry. I was blind. I was a fool. He crawled forward a few inches, his hands reaching out toward the hem of her black silk gown, though he did not dare touch it. I am his father, Arthur begged, looking up at Leo, who was watching him with the exact same cold, assessing stare as the Grand Duke. Please, Eleanor, do not take my son from me. Let me make amends. Let me be a husband to you again. I will change. I swear to you, I will change. Eleanor looked down at the man kneeling before her. She felt no triumph. She felt no lingering pain. She felt only the profound, peaceful emptiness of a debt settled. You are not his father, Eleanor said quietly. A father protects his child. You were the danger I had to protect him from. Arthur buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with loud, ugly sobs. The sound was pathetic, echoing awkwardly in the massive, dignified room. You boasted that I had nowhere to go, Arthur. Eleanor reminded him, her voice lacking any cruelty, which somehow made it worse. You told an entire room of people that I was worthless, but my worth was never tied to your approval. It was tied to the truth. She took a step back, moving away from his grasping hands. Your apologies do not move me, Eleanor said. They are not born of regret for how you treated me. They are born of grief for what you have lost. She turned to Thomas Sterling. Have the guards escort Mr. Hastings off the property, Eleanor commanded, and instruct the bank to formally repossess Hastings Manor by nightfall. She did not look at Arthur again. She turned, holding Leo's hand, and walked back through the private oak doors, leaving the ruined man weeping on the floor of the empire he had lost. The storm had not broken. If anything, the rain falling over London had grown colder, turning the cobblestone streets into slick black mirrors. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, a convoy of black carriages arrived at the towering iron gates of Hastings Manor. They did not bear the crest of the Grand Duke. They bore the austere, unyielding insignia of the Royal Bank of London. Half a dozen bank officials, accompanied by private security guards, marched up the grand stone steps. They did not knock. They used the master keys, authorized by the Sole Trustee, to open the heavy oak doors. Inside the manor, chaos had already taken root. The last of the unpaid servants were packing their meager belongings. The grand foyer, once a stage for Arthur's boastful toasts, was now filled with men in gray suits cataloging everything from the crystal chandeliers to the silver tea sets. Arthur stood in the center of the drawing room. He looked entirely hollowed out. His morning coat was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. The arrogant, flushed confidence that had defined his entire existence had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, empty shell. Hastings, the lead bank official said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. You must vacate the premises immediately. The property and all its contents have been formally repossessed by the estate. This is my home, Arthur whispered, though the protest lacked any real conviction. He looked around at the gilded mirrors, the velvet drapery Isabella had chosen, the crystal decanters he had poured his expensive cognac from. It all felt like a stage set being dismantled around him. It is the property of the trustee, the official corrected sharply. Please step outside, sir, or we will be forced to physically remove you. Arthur did not fight. He did not have the strength. He walked slowly toward the grand foyer. As he reached the heavy oak doors, he realized he had nothing. No luggage, no coat. The accounts were frozen, meaning the clothes in his wardrobe belonged to the bank. He stepped out onto the grand stone steps. The freezing wind immediately hit his face, whipping the rain against his cheeks. The cold seeped through his thin coat instantly. Down the street, several carriages belonging to his wealthy neighbors had slowed, the elite members of society. The same people who had laughed at his cruel jokes and drank his wine were now peering through their velvet curtains, watching his eviction with the same polite, cruel fascination they had offered Eleanor 3 weeks ago. Arthur began to walk down the steps, one slow, agonizing step at a time. His leather shoes slipped slightly against the wet stone. He reached the bottom of the steps and walked toward the towering iron gates. The bank guards fell in step behind him, ensuring he kept moving. They reached the boundary of the property. With a heavy, metallic clang, the iron gates were pushed shut behind him. The lock turned. Arthur Hastings stood on the wet pavement, locked out of his own life. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. He shivered violently, crossing his arms over his chest, looking down the dark, muddy street. He had no carriage waiting for him in the shadows. He had nowhere to go. Up on the second floor of the manor, a warm, golden light spilled from the window of the master study. Eleanor stood near the glass. She had arrived an hour earlier, entering quietly through the private side door. She wore her immaculate black silk gown, her posture as straight and unyielding as ever. In her hands, she held a delicate porcelain teacup. A thin wisp of steam rose from the hot tea, fogging the cold glass slightly. She looked down at the street. She watched Arthur standing in the rain, a small, pathetic figure shivering against the iron gates. She watched the neighbors' carriages slowly roll away, abandoning him to the storm. There was no joy in her chest. There was no sadistic pleasure in watching him suffer. The revenge was not a celebration. It was simply a ledger being balanced. An emotional debt finally paid in full. Arthur looked up. Through the driving rain, he saw her silhouette in the glowing window. He froze. Even from this distance, he could feel the absolute distance between them. She was warm. She was untouchable. She was the architect of his ruin, and she had done it all without raising her voice. Eleanor held his gaze for one long, quiet moment. She did not smile. She did not raise a hand to wave. She simply took a slow sip of her tea. Then she turned her back on the window. She stepped away from the glass, letting the heavy velvet curtains fall shut, plunging Arthur's view into darkness. The room behind her was warm and quiet. The fire crackled brightly in the hearth. Sitting in the large armchair near the flames was Leo, reading a leather-bound book, his dark hair catching the firelight. Eleanor walked toward her son. She set her teacup down and rested her hand gently on the boy's head. The storm raged on outside, washing away the last traces of the man she had once feared. But inside the walls of her empire, the true Hastings legacy was safe, and the woman they broke had returned to claim the throne.